Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the American Watchman Roundtable podcast. I am your host, Sam Whitfield, one of your hosts of the podcast, and joining me tonight are my American Watchman colleagues, Joshua Johnson and Gabe Icaboni. For those of you who are brand new to the channel, we've received over 150 to 200 new subscribers within the past few weeks on this channel for the Whitfield Report, and I really appreciate that. I really do. But the American Watchman Roundtable is a podcast that I put together with two of my other friends here, Josh and Gabe, and we also run a website called AmericanWatchman.org, which is more of like a blog site, although none of us really, except for Gabe, really write on it anymore. So we formed this group podcast just to, form just to discuss the current issues of the week and kind of do a discussion from each of our points of view. So each week we'll each have a topic. We'll each have three topics, and we'll spend 20 minutes moderating on each of them and discussing them. So for all of you who are tuned in, we really appreciate it, and we hope you enjoyed the show. So Josh and Gabe, whichever one of you wants to introduce yourself, let's get this thing started as usual.
For our new listeners, I'm Joshua Johnson. I'm a fellow co-founder of American Watchman with Sam and Gabe, and I just want to thank everybody who subscribed, and I hope you guys enjoy listening to us every week.
And I'm Gabe Icaboni, also a co-founder of American Watchman, and ditto what Josh said.
All right, gentlemen. So I suppose, Gabe, you wanted to start off with the wall. That was kind of your chosen topic, and since you were scheduled to kind of moderate that last week, but since we canceled, you didn't really get a chance, so I figured I would allow you to start us off with that topic.
Oh, sure. I guess I'll just lead in with a quick intro, any changes that have been going on, and then just questions, discussion. Last Friday it was, I believe, as expected, Trump declared a national emergency to build the vaunted wall on the border. And as expected, a number of states, California and 15 others, sued the administration on the wall over the constitutional separation of powers, and in California's case, since it's leading the lawsuit, California sued over the fact that some of the money that would be diverted to the wall would harm the state in regards to anti-drug trafficking activities, and then I think some money that would go to a couple local police departments was also diverted to the wall. So I just wanted to lead in with the general question of what do you guys consider the impact of this, or what do you consider the impact of this will be in terms of whether it actually gets built or not? Because one of the things that has been commented on is that this only affects about, out of the $8 billion that Trump said this would allow him to use, he actually already has $4 billion that he can allocate without the emergency. So where do you guys kind of see this going in terms of the legalities of it and its impact on 2020?
I'm not going to really talk about the legality of it because I don't think I would be qualified or the person who really follows judiciary events enough to actually weigh in on that. But I can discuss the impact. And I'm going to just kind of briefly sum it up for our new listeners, because if you've been listening to our show on a regular basis every week, then you kind of already know where I might be going with this, because I had repeatedly said the last few times we discussed this that I thought Trump should declare the national emergency. But I also think I said at least one time on one of our past discussions that the actual effect of the emergency isn't going to be a wall. It's going to be taken to court as it has been, and it's going to be shot down, and that will allow the administration to easily pivot onto an issue that is less divisive within the party for the 2020 presidential election. Whether or not that's a good thing, or whether or not this whole thing is a good thing, I'm kind of meh, because like I said, I wanted them to declare this national emergency. But on the other hand, it's not going to get us a wall. Even if he's reelected in 2020, I don't think we're going to get a wall because, if, as you might have noticed in the State of the Union, he's increasingly started to move away from the idea of what he originally promised and more towards just another fence, and it's become less of a priority, not so much perhaps to him, but to his advisors, and that's where the real intellectual drive in this administration seems to be. So I don't think we're going to get a wall, period, now, which I'm obviously disappointed in. But in terms of, as I said, pivoting towards a less divisive issue for the party, then I guess, yeah, if you want to see, if you're hoping for a second Trump term, then yeah, that's a good thing for the president because the party is going to have less issues, certainly less issues than the Democrats are already having. But I mean, I'm meh on it. I don't really feel I'm disappointed because it didn't have to turn out like this, and it's just and you can attribute it to Trump not being a politician and not being experienced and not really knowing the ins and outs of how this whole system works, or you can attribute it to the fact that within the palace intrigue that kind of occurred over the first few years of this administration, that the people who were most adamant about getting the wall were the ones who wound up losing the power struggle. But it didn't have to end this way, and I guess I'm gonna maybe leave it open to Sam to see what he adds, and then maybe Gabe can have a follow up, and I can elaborate more if I need to. But that's where I am on it.
Yeah, well, first off, I just have to kind of echo what Josh is saying and saying that I'm not, a legal expert. So as far as like what the legal ramifications of this are, I can't speak to that at all, and I can't really speak to the infrastructural, you know, I can't speak to the technical quality of the wall either. And really, I'm just a guy giving my general opinion here. But um, I guess what it all comes down to for me is um I've stated this before on the podcast. I think when Trump initially uh went out for the wall in 2016, he was playing from a place of right, he's a businessman. So Trump, his style of doing business is he's going to make the most extreme proposition possible, which is that we need a big border wall to secure the border and improve border security. Which a lot of people saw as like a really extreme measure in 2016. Well, now that he's president, we're starting to see him talking more about adding like better security and whatnot. He definitely wants to secure the border, and I do believe that. And as long as he finds a way to secure the border, and make it so that it's not porous like it is right now, I'll be pretty happy. I'm not necessarily hung up on the logistics of actually having like a physical wall. I'm not against it either if it can happen. But I think Trump's overall position, as I've always stated for the past 2 years, has really been more about border security overall. Obviously, I do think it's interesting that Trump declared, a national emergency, citing that the border crisis is an emergency. And I think in some ways he is right. I also do understand. I can see the logic. Some conservatives are worried that by doing this, Trump, by using that logic to justify the building the wall as a national emergency, they're saying that liberals will use this to justify, national health care as like a national emergency. And I can,
I'll kind of alleviate the concerns there, because
yeah,
there are not there have been there are right now 30 executive emergencies in effect, and they don't really do a whole lot. So that's why I've not been concerned about the whole precedent argument, because like I said a few minutes ago, it's not going to get us the wall, and it's not going to get a future Democrat president universal health care or the Green New Deal or whatever they try to do. Executive fiat's not going to do that with the way our system is set up.
No, and there are certain technicalities that you could find with this versus a national emergency like climate change. Because, for example, I have a feeling if this goes to the Supreme Court would do something where they'd say this is a fairly consolidated action towards one area of the country, whereas the arguments that this could lead to a president deciding, well, I want universal health care, I want climate change, that doesn't impact a particular region of the country. It impacts the entire country. So the legal precedent that this will set, I mean, I think that's more, a philosophical argument than anything else,
right.
because, like I said, universal health care is going to be different than building a wall. I mean, a wall is a particular part or region of the country.
I,
Yeah,
I will say that even though I'm disappointed in how this played out, it has caused me. Excuse me, I'm still having my throat issues I've been suffering from. But I have sort of changed in how I see some of this stuff. Even though I'm disappointed in how Trump chose to go about everything and the outcome, I do. It's made me reconsider how important an issue it was. Because if it was a national emergency, why wasn't it declared 2 years? I mean, he phrased it as an emergency when he ran for president. A whole year went by and it was talked about as an emergency, but nothing was done. Another year went by and it was talked about as an emergency and nothing was done.
yeah,
And so it does to me raise some questions about how much this should be prioritized. And don't get me wrong, I do think that the border is still an issue.
oh
And I'm
yeah,
not really okay with the idea of just putting more fences down, because for what I'm seeing is basically him going to doing what George Bush did on it, and that didn't solve the problem either. But what I have sort of reconsidered is thinking about the roots of the problem and why we
right.
have mass waves of immigrants. And I think that's a better area to look at for solutions to the problem than necessarily seeing what more we can do. And don't get me wrong, I do think we can do more on securing our border. It's just I don't prioritize it as highly as I have, I guess. I mean, to me, it doesn't seem like an emergency after watching how they handled it, I guess, if that makes sense to anybody.
Right. No, yeah, Josh, I'm kind of in the same boat. And, just to kind of clarify my point, what I was saying earlier, like I said, I mean, I'm not against the wall. And I mean, if we could get the wall, that would be good, because I think Trump's, proposition for the walls, from what I have seen, are, actually pretty legitimate in theory. I'm not hung up on them, as most people know who have followed this podcast long term. My reason for voting for Trump uh, wasn't necessarily even because I was a main Trump guy in the beginning, although I did, before the primaries were over. My reason was, I was basically to stop Hillary, and also, more to just fight back against the SJW culture. And Trump has, definitely done that symbolically and whatnot. And I think overall as president, he's done a way better job than Barack Obama did. That's for sure. And,
Well, I think the wall. I mean, ultimately, the debate over the wall is just symbolism. But
yeah,
I
I,
like how you phrased that, though, Gabe.
I mean, I
Because
think, I mean, it's a powerful symbol for his base, which is why I think Trump really pushed for it. But I think there's also an unspoken realization by Trump in that it's kind of interesting how he's gone about this, because if it seems like he's doubling down, say, on a losing strategy if you just take a look at the polls. But I think that underneath those top line numbers is there's a realization that no matter how hard Trump pushes on this, it's actually not hurting him with Hispanics, which he'll need to win in 2020. So I don't. The debate over the wall is ultimately symbolism, but I don't think it's doing as much damage to him as a lot of the media likes to portray. I mean, I don't think it's moving the needle one way or the other.
I like how you phrase it as symbolism, because I think, and also what Sam said, because I wasn't, my primary reason for liking Trump throughout was his radically different approach to foreign policy, and we'll get into that later. But uh, Sam knows what's coming. But, uh, but that was my primary reason. Although I think and I was concerned about immigration, and I continue to be concerned about it. But I think to Gabe's point about it being symbolism, I think, and Sam's point about confronting the SJW culture, the politically correct culture, I think a lot of reason that resonated so much with people was partly because of the actual impacts of mass migration, which have not been good for working class Americans at all, particularly those that have to compete with the constant flow of cheap labor across the board. And partly because it was, as Gabe notes, the idea of a Berlin Wall-esque kind of thing just is anathema to the politically correct culture. And people liked to see that because it represented sort of a philosophical shift away from how we view what America's role in the world is and how we handle challenges like this. And I think that's what a lot of people liked. Although I also think, as I mentioned, that there were the practical ways that mass migration hurt a lot of working class people. And you saw that particularly in the Rust Belt. But I like how you phrased that, Gabe.
Well, thank you.
Yeah. So, I mean, so in terms of the wine, this is your topic, Gabe. So did you have any other points you wanted to bring up or any other questions, or shall we move on to Professor Johnson here?
I did not have any other questions or comments, concerns, other than it'll just be interesting how this will play out, especially how big an issue it becomes in 2020. But I sort of am like you guys. I think it will be kind of just a little side issue, and I think it will fade in relevance compared to the other bigger issues that come up. So with that, I'll hand it off.
I know we have a bit more time for the first subject, so maybe I might throw something in that can generate some conversation. As I mentioned, I was not satisfied with the way it played out, and I'm not satisfied with the fact that essentially what I think this national emergency does is it basically means the wall is never going to happen, and it allows Trump to put it in his rearview mirror for good for the rest of his presidency, even if he's reelected, because it was the premier promise. And if you don't fulfill that in your first term, you've essentially broken it. But they found a way, as I said, to use this emergency and the court challenge it presents to kind of direct all of the sheep in a different direction, if you will.
See
that's not to beat, and that's not to beat up on everybody, because I know there are a lot of Trump supporters that are like me that have tried to hold the president accountable to his promises, but there are also a lot of people who just kind of do the whole 40 chess thing, like Sean Hannity. And
Mike Cernovich
constantly will justify anything he does, and I'm afraid that's what this. I don't like the idea. Here's what I'm essentially saying. I don't like the idea that somebody can make a promise like that, even if a lot of its appeal was the symbolism, that somebody can make a promise like that and then do absolutely nothing different from what we've been doing on it, and then get away with doing nothing different, from going about business as usual, from changing nothing after campaigning for radical change, and then just not, there's no consequences to that. That's my essential problem here.
Well,
Right.
I'll agree, I'll agree with that to an extent, but I think, I mean, to punish somebody for that, you have to counterbalance that with the fact that the system is set up to block him from doing. The system is set up to block anybody from making radical change. I mean, whether it's the courts, whether it's the bureaucracy, whether it's political power, say shifting in an election, our system really is set up to block any sort of radical change, especially when it's coming from the executive level, or when it's coming from such a non-conventional figure as Trump. So, I mean, I think you can blame him to an extent and hold him responsible for to an extent, but you have to weigh that against what was working against him in the first place. I mean, Josh, you made the point that Trump sort of had to work with the Republican Party. He didn't just necessarily have it remade for him by the time he won office. So you have to take into account things like Paul Ryan, the Speaker of the House, and Mitch McConnell, the Senate Majority Leader, were opposed to this idea, and the Democrats were opposed to this idea, and that the courts were opposed to it. And we know damn well the bureaucracy was opposed to it. So, he didn't exactly have an immediate path to make this happen. So that, I think that has to be weighed when assessing whether he gets away with doing it or not, or whether he did enough to make it happen or not.
I'll agree there was no conventional path to it, but I mean, the way I've often viewed it, excuse me, throat issues again. The way I've viewed it is in terms of political capital. Starting in 2017, when he was sworn in, Trump had all of the political capital within GOP circles anyway. All the political capital was in his corner on this in order to remake the party. And as you mentioned, there were people, there were established party leadership figures and establishment types that were already there who were dead set against him and everything he wanted to do. They were against changing the Republican Party. They were the old guard, and they were going to stubbornly hold their line no matter what. But Trump was the one that demonstrably beat them within a GOP primary, with the party's actual members and the party's most diehard supporters, the ones that actually show up in primary elections. He won hands down over and over again against all the other conventional GOP candidates. So as I view it, he had the political capital, and what could have been done if I were in his position, he could have gone in and talked to the GOP caucus privately in a meeting with them, and made it pretty clear that here's my agenda that I got elected to do. Your guys is lost in the primary. Mine was the one that won the White House, not your guys' in 2012. Here's how we're going to do it. And you can either get behind me with this, or I can go out there in front of the cameras and tell my voters that are all in my corner that their party doesn't care about them, doesn't want to have the changes necessary, and we can go ahead and sit here and do nothing for 2 years, and I'll declare war on you all in the midterms. And you might say, well, Mitch McConnell might say, well, Trump, you're going to hand over the House to the Democrats or the Senate to the Democrats anyway. Well, one, doing it their way, that happened anyway. And two, I think at some level, if you want to have change, you have to make the threat of, well, yeah, I'm going to be captain of the ship, and if I'm not going to be captain of the ship, I'll make sure the whole thing sinks with me. And I'm not talking about the country. I'm talking about the party. In terms of what, for a lot of us, was kind of a shifting out of the old guard of the GOP in the 2016 primary, and then that didn't happen. It sort of boggles the mind that somebody could have had all the political capital in their corner, and then manages to for either as a result of incompetence or as the result of being too trusting, he manages to let the old guard take over and basically run the show until such time as he's no longer able to achieve what he ran on.
Well, I think you hit the nail on the head in terms of that. I don't think that's Trump's style, and maybe it is part of that he was naive when he came in, thinking that he would just get his way. Um, I mean, because that's the difference between politics and business. For better or worse, you can't run the government like you run a business because the government doesn't have a profit incentive. Um, so I mean, Trump could have done things a different way, but I think that he was. I mean, I'll give him a little more of the benefit of the doubt than you will, just because Republican politics for so long have been consumed with things like healthcare reform or repealing Obamacare and tax reform. Those were issues that were more salient to the party than Trump. And I don't even think Trump could have overcome that, no matter how hard he tried. I do honestly believe that, because it's more uniting for the party than immigration. I mean, Josh, you've talked about realignment a lot, and I agree with it. But the Republican Party has not completely realigned itself, and so some of the issues that Trump ran on and still holds pretty dearly are issues that do divide the party more than things like lower taxes or making healthcare portable. Immigration is a more divisive issue in general. And so, I mean, it takes a pretty persuasive figure to unite a party along those lines. And I would argue it takes somebody more persuasive than Trump.
It's not just immigration though. I mean, if you look, and I know we're going to get into this, so I'm not going to say too much about it. And maybe it's a good way to transition. Maybe that was subconsciously part of my thinking when I brought this up. But it's not just immigration. It was the way he broke from the GOP establishment completely on immigration. Sorry, it is just immigration. No, it's the way he broke with the party completely also on foreign policy. The way that candidate Trump was actually running around saying, "We're going to have universal health care. I'm going to find a way to get it for everybody," and then that managed to completely get sort of pushed down by Reince Priebus after he actually won the nomination. The way that Trump came out and said that not only are we going to not cut Social Security or Medicare or Medicaid, we're going to find ways to expand these programs. He challenged the GOP on almost every level. On almost every level, he bucked Republican orthodoxy. It's why he had to come out and say, this is not the conservative party, this is the Republican Party. And then after the Republican convention and after Reince Priebus began to take a larger and larger role in his campaign, that sort of went away. And you can say, well, those were just Trump not knowing a lot about politics. But if you look at some of the people that were more or less his brain during the campaign, the people that did a lot of his thinking on stuff like this, they were outsider figures like Steve Bannon, who wound up pushing those kind of issues all the way through the first half of the administration until finally Bannon, in his case, went too far and said he wanted to have the 68% income tax rate on top earners, and that was too much, and he was forced out of the White House by the Republican elites there. So it wasn't just immigration. It was that, and maybe that speaks to your point still, that they didn't feel they could radically abandon their donor class. And I kind of understand that. But at the same time, that's kind of what needed to happen, I think.
Well, I think it'll happen sooner rather than later. I just don't think the party was there yet to do it.
Well, let me jump in here real quick because Josh said something way early on, which I want a few minutes ago, which I wanted to address, which is that Trump hasn't fulfilled his first term campaign promises, and that's looking pretty bad, due to the fact that the wall was a first term promise. But let me just say that I read an article. I can't remember who or where it was from, so apologies to whomever is watching. But basically, the gist of this article basically said that after Trump wins re-election in 2020, he can focus more on the wall because he won't have to worry about the prospect of the Democrats trying to use, the quote unquote oppressiveness as the wall as like a, counter attack ad during the during re-election. And oddly, this article actually compared Trump in that way to Obama in terms of uh, Obama for his first few years really, if you think about it, really wasn't that radical with his policies compared to the last 4 years, post 2012. That was when we really saw Obama kick his leftist policies into gear more. And, that was also when we saw the SJW culture take hold more too, but that's another subject for another, maybe for later on. But, I think what I would say is if you're planning on giving up hope just because the wall's not here yet, I'm not giving up on Trump is my bottom line with this. And I would implore that none of the listeners or viewers do either.
I guess I would kind of disagree with you directly because I saw it in opposite terms with Obama. He accomplished a lot more during his first term than he did his second term. And that's not just Obama, that's presidents generally, because once you're a lame duck president, your influence and your ability to work with Congress just starts to decline. And after that second year of your first term, if you've not, of your second term, my bad, after that second year of your second term, you're pretty much done. They've moved on from you at that point, and they're looking to the future already. In Obama's case, he was able to achieve the most important issue of his entire presidency from his perspective, which was getting Obamacare and getting that handled. In the second term, he focused more on foreign policy, which presidents tend to do because, as I said, you begin to lose your influence with Congress. So what can a president do without having to deal with them all the time? He can turn to foreign policy usually. But in the first term, that was, and from Obama's perspective, the Obamacare bill, the Affordable Care Act, as they called it, was the chief accomplishment for him. And you kind of look at Trump's first term and what is the chief accomplishment? You could argue it's the tax bill, but if our long-term readers and listeners may remember, I made a prediction quite some time ago where I criticized the thing roundly. I was not a fan of it. I was with Steve Bannon on it, but there were a few good things, like getting rid of the individual mandate. But I believe I made a prediction that people aren't going to notice a few extra dollars here and there on their paychecks. And lo and behold, here we've come around to the first tax year where this bill is in effect, and people are outraged. And you see it on the news almost every night. They've chosen to run with it. And I've seen it at our firm. People are outraged because they feel like they're not getting as big of a refund. And it's not proving to be the mass successful re-election thing that Paul Ryan sort of promised to Trump. So that's, to Gabe's point, I think that's why you're seeing Trump try to pivot to judges and trying to pivot to other issues to try and win voters, because he's not going in a really strong position, it doesn't look like.
I think, well, I'll disagree with that to an extent, actually, because Bush passed tax cuts in 2003, and the same argument was made about Bush's tax cuts in 2003, which is they're not visibly benefiting him. But I think with the tax cuts, especially with tax cuts in particular, it's not a single variable, or it's not going to lead to a single variable that you can point to for a president's reelection. What it will do is it will goose the economy and make everybody feel better about the economy, which will then make a president in a stronger position. So, I mean, I understand the point of there's outrage right now because everybody got less of a refund. And then the counter argument, which is, but you're paying less in taxes overall, so your refund isn't going to be that big to begin with. But the bigger story is the benefit it provides the economy, which is mostly what determines whether presidents get reelected or not. So, I mean, I don't see it. It may not help Trump. I don't think it's going to hurt him either. So, I mean, I don't see the tax cuts being a hindrance on Trump's reelection. Whether it was more important than, say, Trump's promise of building a wall, that's debatable. But I think I think the tax cuts will actually prove to be a benefit to Trump. I just don't think it's going to be easy to tell that it's a benefit. I think the proof in the pudding is going to be when the economy is still strong when he runs for re-election.
I wasn't saying if it was going to be a major boost or a major stumbling block for him in 2020. It was kind of, as you said, it was meh to the majority of the American people. It didn't really stir feelings one way or the other unless you're somebody who's overtly political like we are. And more to my point though, which was, what can we say that this administration accomplished? Major lasting accomplishment in the first term. And so far, it doesn't seem that they've been able to do that. Whereas Obama, even though I'm not a fan of his, but I'll admit, and I'm not a fan of Obamacare either. I've been saying we needed to get rid of it. But I'll at least admit that you can say, look, he got something done during his first term. And going into this, and this goes back to Sam's point because I was essentially disagreeing with him and with the article. If Trump gets reelected and the argument is, well, now I'll be able to do all the stuff I said I wanted to do, not really, because you've not got anything done when you had the political capital, when you had the Congress that was willing to work with you. Now, after you get reelected, assuming you get reelected, you've got even less time. You've got at least at the most, you've got 2 years, and then after that, the Congress is basically done with you. So I guess I'm not optimistic, and sort of to Sam's closing point on whether or not he gave up on Trump, I guess I wouldn't encourage our listeners to do either of those. I would encourage our listeners to think for themselves and to look less at personalities and more at the actual issues you're concerned about, because that's sort of been the deal with me and why I can't really say I'm too keen on the president anymore.
Yeah, I mean, it'll be interesting. Let me put it this way. I'm not one of these people who is like, well, 40. I'm not Bill Mitchell. Where I just say, 40 chess. You just don't understand what Trump is doing. But I think I don't think the wall should be the make or break thing for.
I'll agree with you on that. I'll agree with you on that, because even with me, the wall, while that was a contributing factor, what ultimately, and you guys have seen my reasoning already, but our listeners haven't. For me, the disappointment with Trump comes transition time, mainly from foreign policy, but also from a whole series of other issues I discussed, but mainly with like the tax bill. But the wall thing, while I was disappointed with how it ended, I wouldn't say that should be the hinging thing for anybody either, because as we've sort of made clear in the first segment, it's a meh kind of, the way this whole thing is played out. It's meh. So
yeah, it's not bad, but it's not good. It's just meh at this point. So anyway, Mr. Johnson, what would you like to talk about in regards to foreign policy?
Well, I was actually wanting to discuss Venezuela, because that has literally been all the presidents or Mike Pompeo or John Bolton, or most recently today, Marco Rubio has been able to talk about constantly. And it's kind of mind-boggling how little mention it's gotten in the press. It's gotten a little bit, but a lot of the rhetoric that come from this administration in the last few days has been eerily reminiscent of the way Bush was talking about Saddam Hussein during the buildup to the Iraq War. And it's been overtly aggressive. It's been the rhetoric towards Venezuela. I don't know if I said Venezuela already, but that's what I'm talking about for our listeners. The rhetoric has been overtly aggressive. It's been very militaristic. It's been to quote one of them, quite frankly, Mike Pompeo just said yesterday, "Your days are numbered," to Nicolas Maduro, and to some extent, to calm some of our listeners down, if you are somebody who agrees more with me, it's not necessarily that we're at the end of the world yet. I think there is some wishful thinking in the way our elites, political and media, talk about it. For example, a few weeks ago, there was a story in The Guardian saying that President Maduro's military officers are on the verge of having a coup any day now. And I was discussing it with somebody, and I basically sent them 5 even older articles from Syria, where almost on a monthly basis they were saying that there were military officers prepared to ditch on Assad, and then none of them ever happened. So there is some wishful thinking in the way the rhetoric is played out from the media and from this administration. So that's kind of the silver lining. But otherwise, it's been eerily reminiscent of the way Bush talked about Saddam. And I'll maybe open it to more specific questions from you guys now.
I would just kind of comment and say this whole Venezuela situation is very interesting because it seems like the neocons are, of course, chomping at the bit for us to go into Venezuela based on what I've seen from them on Twitter and in the news and in the big talk shows and all that stuff. But I do want to go back to the State of the Union a few weeks ago. I even alluded to this on the Whitfield report once, that perhaps when Trump was saying Americans don't fight, unnecessary wars, I think maybe that was kind of like him sticking his, giving the neocons the proverbial middle finger in regards to Venezuela. So
it is for the more casual observer, a lot of this stuff is probably, I've seen a lot of people who don't follow it quite as closely as us feel like the president is bipolar when it comes to this, because sometimes he'll do really good things where he'll say no foreign wars and we're going to meet with Kim Jong-un in Vietnam and we're going to have peace. But then in other cases, it is the complete opposite, like in Syria and Venezuela. And I think for the more casual observer, what you have to understand is there is a difference, even though I compare him to Bush. There is a crucial difference between the way Trump seems to look at these things and the way that Bush looked at these things. And Bush and most of the neoconservatives who are with Trump on Venezuela and Iran and Syria, the neoconservatives are ideologically driven to spread American-style democracy around the globe. So that's why they want to go everywhere, be it, like John McCain said, we'll invade Cuba, we'll invade North Korea, we'll invade Nigeria, we'll invade Libya. He listed all the countries where he thought we needed regime change at one point in the Senate. It was ideologically driven. With Trump, you don't really see that, and it is much more financially driven. It's driven by the donor class. And so you see, for example, a country like North Korea, where, coincidentally enough, there's no oil. Trump will go around and praise Kim Jong-un as an economic genius, even though he clearly isn't. And he'll be wanting to have friendly relations with him, which is a good thing. I'm happy he's doing that. I will praise Trump for the way he's handled Korea, but it's different from Venezuela and Syria and Iran because there is no financial incentive for our elites in North Korea. But there is in Venezuela, which has the world's largest oil reserves, which is why the rhetoric doesn't match up, and also why Trump contradicts himself ideologically. As I noted, he praised Kim Jong-un as being an economic genius when the economy is totally state-controlled and there is much worse issues economically within North Korea than there are in Venezuela, where the economy is 70% private sector still. And yet he will turn around and talk about Venezuela as though the reason is because they're socialists, even though that really isn't it. It's because of the oil, because if it was, there wouldn't be that. So that's the crucial difference. It's ideologically driven interventionism from the neoconservatives. And with Trump, it seems to be a much more mercantilist approach where, well, can I make money off this? And in Venezuela, the answer to that for American elites and for this administration appears to be yes, because of the oil. So there is a difference. That is the crucial difference for our listeners who sometimes get confused about why Trump seems to go back and forth on this.
The way the neocons have gone, covering Venezuela, it seems to me like they're trying to equate Venezuela to Cuba. And I mean, maybe this is a particular thing with Marco Rubio and more specifically here to Florida, but like a lot of the neocons kind of that I've encountered in real life, some of whom are my neighbors, granted they're older boomers, they tend to talk about Venezuela and kind of like equate it to Cuba, and that's obviously not the
Well,
case.
here's the question you can ask them. Several questions. One, have you seen any news articles over the last 10 years or so about Cuba having mass food shortages? No. Since the embargo has been lifted and since the travel restrictions have been lifted, if you've gone to Cuba, have you noticed people standing in bread lines, or have you noticed the stores being completely empty? No. The problems in Cuba and Venezuela, and we discussed this a little bit last time, so I'm not going to go too much into it, but I will raise something slightly new. The problem in Cuba and Venezuela essentially is sanctions, as we've discussed before, and certain poor decisions made by Nicolas Maduro. Perhaps the biggest of which being the idea that you can simply print money to solve your problems. Because hyperinflation is what causes people needing wheelbarrows full of money to buy $20,000 toilet paper, like in Venezuela. You don't see that in Cuba because the Cuban government's not been printing money constantly. And that's what Maduro's been doing since 2015. It's not a uniquely socialist problem. It's a problem that we saw in Weimar Germany during the 1930s and the Great Depression prior to Hitler's seizure of power, where the government was just printing money like crazy and people needed entire wheelbarrows full of Deutschmarks to buy a loaf of bread. So the comparison to Cuba simply isn't apt, and all you have to do is ask people to compare the two of them, if they've been there or if they've been an avid reader of news in the region, which again most people probably aren't. But they're not really comparable in that way. It's interesting. The real new thing that's sort of been in the news this last week has been the kerfuffle over humanitarian aid. Because, and maybe we mentioned this last time, but President Maduro shut down the highways leading in from Colombia because there were U.S. aid, not International Red Cross. They've actually released a letter boycotting this, but U.S. aid, which is a U.S. government aid organization that sometimes does actually provide aid to countries like in Africa, and other times does crap like they're trying to do in Venezuela, which is why other aid organizations have avoided it. Because in some of the trucks that they were trying to drive across the Colombian border, there were weapons in these USAID containers. In a airplane from USAID that was downed, not downed as in shot down, but it was forced to land by the Venezuelan Air Force, they found military-grade weapons that were trying to be smuggled into the country, presented as aid. So the issue has essentially been the U.S. government says Maduro is a horrible monster. He's not letting humanitarian aid get into these people who clearly need it. And the problem is this. If you're really concerned about helping the ordinary Venezuelans, lift the sanctions so the ordinary Venezuelans can buy the things they need on the international market. Stop cutting Venezuelans off from the rest of the world if you're complaining about them not being able to get things from the rest of the world. Because for all of its history, Venezuela has produced pretty much nothing but oil. There's no good farmland. There's nothing. There's no manufacturing industry. There's no agricultural industry. They have had to import for most of their history. They've had to use money from oil to import what they need. So when you put sanctions on them, it hurts them more than ordinary countries. So first, if you want to help them, end the sanctions. Second, let your humanitarian aid be subject to the checks from the proper authorities, which USAID has not wanted to do. They've just wanted to get aid directly to the people, as they put it. But how can anybody check if there are weapons like the Venezuelan government has found with that airplane they chose to bring down? Third, as I kind of mentioned before, International Red Cross, which also does probably more aid than USAID or any other governmental aid organization does for people that are suffering, they have specifically refused to cooperate in this campaign of the U.S. government's because they know it's not humanitarian aid. It's an attempt to spark a civil war in the country in order to justify intervention. They've refused to have anything to do with it. And other countries that have supported the legitimate government of Venezuela have been sending aid. Just this last week, shipments from China, Russia, Turkey, and Iran made it to Venezuela through the proper channels that USAID refuses to use. So it's not about Maduro supposedly preventing his people from getting what they need. It's more essentially about Maduro stopping weapons from being brought into an already heated and volatile situation, and the U.S. government not being particularly interested in alleviating these people's plight. but actually continuing it with the sanctions, because the goal of the U.S. government is regime change. It's not to help the people. The sanctions are to make people suffer so that they'll hopefully revolt against the government. The attempt to smuggle weapons in is in the hope that they will reach the hands of extremists and the opposition, and they'll be able to spark an uprising. It's not about helping the people. It's about the oil. It's about regime change.
Yeah, I mean, I can't really disagree with you on that.
I'm surprised Gabe hasn't asked anything. Maybe he's not followed it too closely. I don't know.
I don't follow it that closely. To be honest, I mean the issue in Venezuela is sort of as you and Josh as you and Sam sort of described the wall as meh. To me, Venezuela is honestly a meh. Because I mean, my opinion of it is until boots hit the ground, the rhetoric can be what it's going to be, but until we actually send troops there, it mostly is just rhetoric. And I mean, we can echo that it's the neocons going to bat for war again, but maybe there are boots on the ground now that we don't know about. But Venezuela, to me, is still a far cry from a conflict when we're actually fighting conflicts. I mean, to me, the fact that Trump came out today or yesterday, I think, and said that, oh, we'll still have troops in Syria even after a withdrawal is a bigger issue to me than Venezuela. But I'm just speaking personally of myself.
I guess I would, speaking from the situation in Syria is that, and I would first like to point out I'm against the president leaving troops there. I saw that, but I sort of have the meh reaction because in the end, those troops can't do anything but protect the YPG, the Kurdish forces in the north eastern half of the country. And part of the reason that they switched, since you mentioned it, I'll explain for our listeners. Part of the reason that Trump went back on that is because 2 days ago, Syrian President Bashar al-Assad was giving a speech, and it was a speech that was written based on the idea that the U.S. was completely pulling out. And Assad said he didn't name the Kurds directly, but it was understood that he was referring specifically to them, that the Americans will, and I'm paraphrasing him now, the Americans will not protect you. Only your state can protect you. Only we can protect you from the Turks. Because President Erdogan, as those who observe this may know, is very strongly anti-Kurdish. He has already attacked Kurdish forces in the northwestern half of the country, and he has threatened to attack the Kurds that are aligned with the United States in the northeastern half. And if the U.S. would have completely withdrawn, as Assad noted, the Turks, the Kurds there essentially have two options. They can sit and try and hold the Turks off on their own, or they can lay down their arms and allow the Syrian army to come in and regain the territory and protect them. And so that is what I think Trump probably based that decision on. But for me, it's a bit of a, even though I'm against it, it's a bit of a meh, because what can those U.S. troops do? They're not going to attack Assad and the Russian and Iranians there. The U.S. essentially doesn't have the capability to directly intervene as much as neocons would like us to have in Syria. It's a different story in Venezuela, because Venezuela is in our backyard. It's not in Russia or Iran's backyard anymore. It's in where we have the home playing field advantage, kind of. And so the risk of intervention there in Venezuela is far greater than anything in Syria at this point. Partially because Assad has more or less won the war against the terrorists. What essentially remains now is border disputes between the Syrian government, the Kurds, and the Turks, all of whom are on their own side. In Venezuela, to your point on the rhetoric, I guess the rhetoric is important before we reach the point of having boots on the ground, because that's what the whole debate over Iraq was. It was there was the arguments by those who opposed the drumbeat to war, and ultimately they lost, and we saw how that turned out. And I think that's the concern a lot of people have about Venezuela. And this isn't the first time. I think Sam kind of mentioned this isn't the first time we've tried to overthrow the government there either. We did it in 2005 and failed too.
Yeah, I mean, it didn't work. It didn't work out then. So, yeah, but I mean, I also kind of got to agree with Gabe. it's all theoretical at this point. So, anyway, though, on to things that are non-theoretical. First off, do you have any other points you want to bring up?
I think I pretty well covered all my bases with the new information and what's happened. I will quickly make a shout out to Marco Rubio, who managed to somehow make the absolute worst case for intervention possible today. By all he did was tweet a picture of Gaddafi before he was murdered, and then a picture of Gaddafi while he was in the process of being murdered. And I think it kind of shows you how they've learned absolutely nothing because, as I think I said to you guys, well, it worked out so well last time, didn't it? So why not again?
Wait. Marco tweeted out like a photo of Gaddafi,
I sent it to our group chat. It was there was no text. It was just a picture of Gaddafi sitting at a parade or a conference or something. It looked like, and then right next to it, the second picture he uploaded with it was a screen cap from the video of Gaddafi being sodomized with a knife as he was murdered.
That was kind of strange. I'll admit. And I'm a fan of Rubio on domestic policy, but that was kind of strange.
It was and I don't know what anyone was, because if he thinks Libya is a good example of why we should intervene, then I think it discredits him from ever becoming president. But it was just the worst possible thing to do, and also it just didn't look good. As I told you guys, Rubio, I assume, as a fellow Catholic, went to mass this morning, and I don't understand how he could have heard today's daily gospel reading and then turned around and tweeted out pictures seemingly celebrating a brutal murder with the implication that he was threatening somebody else with a similar brutal murder. It just didn't look good.
Yeah, I mean, even without context, like if I'm like a normie, just like if I'm a normie, just like completely, and I have no idea what's going on, like why a senator would just tweet that with like no I mean, that's just were you hitting the Cuban rum hard last night, Marco Rubio? I've got to wonder. So
maybe he let Trump borrow his Twitter account.
That is pretty funny. Trump's more responsible on Twitter than Marco Rubio is.
I'm like, wow, Trump's tweets aren't looking so. Trump is no longer the edgelord that we thought he was. It's now Marco Rubio is the edgelord of the United States political, class. So,
on to hoaxes, though, I believe you were about to say.
Yeah, on to hoaxes, on to news that is not speculative, on to something that pretty much before I could even get to it, pretty much wrapped itself up completely. Apparently, Jussie Smollett was the first American to ever scam two Nigerians instead of the reverse. So obviously, most listeners will know, but for those who don't, who have been hiding under a rock, Jussie Smollett, who I guess was a actor on the show called Empire, he essentially last week or sometime within the past couple weeks claimed that he was assaulted in Chicago by two Trump supporters who were wearing MAGA hats, and it basically stirred up a big controversy and obviously got paraded, on all the news circuits. And we heard again about how the alt-right is, on the rise again. And is this Charlottesville too? And, stuff like that. It has since been revealed that he essentially staged this whole thing for publicity. And what's hilarious to me is the media is either so dumb or they're just playing along with the narrative. Today I saw one of the anchors on NBC morning news was like, well, we're not really sure why Smollett did it, but it's a tragedy either way. And it's like, no, it's not a tragedy. He staged a hoax. Like, that's not a tragedy in the same vein as like Charlottesville or anything like that. So
Here's the thing, the two things for me. I think it's hilarious, first off, that he wrote a personal check with his own name on it that he signed in the commission of crime. That's like
yeah,
new levels of stupidity right there. But excuse me, my throat does not want to agree with me tonight. But
I would also add, who still writes checks?
that's also a good point.
Kind of rare.
Right? I write them only for one company that says I have an account with them, but when I go to pay online, they claim my account number is a real account. So that's the only time I write checks. But that also. But the second thing is I don't think the media falling for it is funny. I'm more disturbed by the media aspect of it because it seems to demonstrate that only certain kinds of people are believed.
right. I mean,
Everybody instantly believed the accuser when Kavanaugh was on there, or when Judge Roy Moore was on there, or when I forget the name of the governor I was defending, the Democrat last week. I haven't heard anything about his case. Fairfax, not Northup, Fairfax.
Oh,
And in those cases, they're instantly the person is instantly believed. But in this case, they believe him and seem to sympathize with him instantly because of the fact he's a gay man. And even though the story made no sense, because the original story was that he was walking around in Chicago at night and he was approached by two white guys wearing MAGA hats, and that they had rope with which to try and lynch him, and they threw a chemical on him. For the sake of my example, we'll say it was bleach. I don't know if it was, but here's the thing, though, and they all instantly believed that because of his identity, because because of his claimed identity, because he was gay. Even though it made no sense, because if you're a white guy walking around in Chicago with a Trump hat, carrying a noose and a bottle of bleach around at night, you're asking to get shot. And just didn't make sense. They also said it was MAGA country to him, he claimed. But it's disturbing not just because the media instantly believes him because of his identity and sympathizes with him because of that afterwards. It's because of how easy it showed this could be abused, because up until it was exposed that he knew the two suspects, he was saying that he was ready to testify in court and he was going to go and put these two guys away so they couldn't hurt anybody else and blah, 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 blah. He was essentially, if they would have brought in two random people that were totally innocent, he was willing to testify in court. He was willing to ruin two innocent people's lives. And now he seems that whole aspect seems to have been forgotten. But that should be a crime unto itself. But because he's a gay man, nobody wants to discuss that. They were all ready to believe him instantly, even though the story made no sense. And now, even after he's been exposed as a hoaxer, they're afraid to go after him as a hoaxer because, that might delegitimize real anti-gay hate crimes, even though, as far as I can tell, that's not a common everyday occurrence anywhere in this country.
Right. Well, I mean, when I say it's humorous, right, and most folks know I have a pretty dark sense of humor. I mean it's humorous in that it is kind of humorous in like a really, dark way. And I mean, like I said, either the media is completely ignorant and they're even, bigger idiots than we thought, or they're inherently complicit in stoking the fires of SJW culture. And I honestly have to believe that, I mean, sure, you may have a few simpletons in the newsroom who, quite honestly are gullible, but I definitely do think that there are, that the mainstream media is orchestrating, maybe not orchestrating, but helping to promote these hoaxes in an effort to, spark the race war or whatever that the left is so desperately wanting. It's very disturbing to me because I saw a whole bunch of articles from places like well, I mean, granted, they were mostly Medium articles, and Medium tends to deal a big lefty place anyway. But you know, point. But a lot of these articles were talking. Oh, this is the alt-right. They want to start a race war. They want to start a race war, and it's like, well, no. Smollett scammed. Smollett produced a hoax, but it's interesting that you bring up a race war because it almost seems like the left kind of wants a race war almost with how much they talk all this, and it is deeply scary that they're just going on blindly with this narrative.
I will say that I watched a monologue from Greg Gutfeld the other night on this, which is actually where 90% of my information on this comes from. But he made a good point, which was we have so much racial intolerance in this country, we have to make it up, and that's exactly what this is. What
Right.
you couldn't find enough people wandering down a street actually practicing intolerance. You had to pretend like it actually happened. I mean, it's what you said, Sam. It's they're trying to incentivize this kind of intolerance and anger to get people outraged. I mean, ultimately, it's part of outrage culture that we have to make things up to make people get upset about. I mean that's essentially what it is, and the sad part is, I mean, I don't want to downplay what you said, Josh. Is it could have destroyed two people's lives, and I think is that I think it's a philosophical question of, is that really how far we have to go to prove a point, regardless of what the point is? Are we willing to destroy people's lives to make a point? I mean, that in itself is a very dangerous precedent to set in any way.
I think you guys know that I had sent you an article talking about another place in the world where you kind of see this happening, where there are people from the LGBT community basically making things up in order to play the victimhood card. And it's really fascinating to me because I have watched this for a while now. And there are people who are not like this, but they are the ones who are also less flamboyant as well. So they've not placed the entire concept of who they are as people into their sexuality. But there are the gay people, and you've all met them, I'm sure, at some point. The kind where if you assume, and it, like the people that flip out and say you assumed my gender or whatever, right? Or the people that say if you disagree with homosexuality on moral as a moral activity, if you disagree with it on that grounds, they flip out and they become very angry and aggressive with you. And I've found this to be particularly interesting because I like to study psychology. And what you see happening in cases like that is the activation of the fight or flight response in the brain. It basically turns on when your brain feels that you are in physical danger, you are in danger of being wiped out, you're in danger of being killed. In their case, it's not so much that they feel that you're physically about to kill them, that you're going to pull a gun out and shoot them and they won't be there anymore. But it's like people who have narcissistic personality disorder. People who have narcissistic personality disorder have a dichotomy in their brain that we call it splitting, where there is the real self, which is very insecure and very hidden away, and there is the ideal self. And that's the puffed up version that's perfect and can never do anything wrong. And they identify with the ideal self. That's why they act so very arrogant, people with narcissistic personality disorder. And if you challenge that image, if you break through the shell and kind of see the real them underneath, if you say you're not as great as you are or whatever, that can sometimes trigger what in psychology is called narcissistic rage, where they will become irrationally and unreasonably angry. Sometimes, if they're more pathological, to the point that this will cause murder and crime, where it will cause them to do things that could harm other people. And you see it sort of with people in the homosexual community, because many of them, not all of them, many of them have put their entire identity into their sexuality. It's become their ideal self. And if you challenge that in any way, then they feel as though they're physically under attack. You're going to destroy who they are. That's why that fight or flight response kicks in. And it's interesting in relation to Smollett, because part of having your entire identity invested into an ideal self that's not necessarily reflective of who you really are is that you have to justify the idea that other people don't like it. And in narcissists, this is why we see as a symptom for NPD, you actually have to demonstrate so many symptoms, but one of the symptoms you can demonstrate or have to demonstrate to get it is being persistently of the opinion that other people are jealous of you. Because obviously, if you think other people are jealous of you, that justifies your worldview of thinking you're the greatest person in the world, because of course they'd be jealous of you, right? With people that have invested their entire identity into their sexuality and have taken up this false idea that they are homosexual, they have the same kind of people like Jussie Smollett. They have the same thing going on, where in order to justify all the entire LGBT community's push for constant new rights and constant new protections, they have to feel as though they are oppressed. And so in his case, because that oppression, as Gabe noted, doesn't exist in this country, there's nobody going around lynching gays all the time. He turns to making it up. He fakes it. He sort of experiences a version of this narcissistic rage, kind of. And to me, it's interesting. I see parallels between a lot of people who embrace homosexuality as an identity and people who have narcissistic personality disorder. And that's not all gay people, although it seems to be most of them. And as a Catholic, what I believe is that our identity is ultimately in Christ, and we are constantly being made to compete with all these other alternative identities, be it putting your identity entirely in being white and all the problems that causes, like Richard Spencer, or putting your identity entirely in being sexuality. It's putting your identity in things other than Christ, other than what God made you to be. And that's why they have these kind of reactions, because deep down, the inner self knows that they're not like that. And then when it's challenged, or when it's not being oppressed, and the idea that identity can slip away from them becomes apparent, they have something similar to narcissistic rage, where they freak out like the ma'am guy did in the store, screaming it's ma'am and kicking stuff and threatening to fight people. Or whether it's Jussie Smollett faking hate crimes against himself in order to justify those feelings of being oppressed that he tells himself have to be there in order to justify what his community pushes in terms of politics.
Josh, I think that's a very good summary. And as a fellow Christian, I too have to say that, I think this whole thing with people taking their, trying to find their identity outside of Christ, too, is very dangerous. And we also see this with people who try to search for their identity in politics too, both on the left and in the right. I mean, there are some people who like who do MAGA like pretty hard, and that becomes their identity almost.
And you see the same thing too. Like if you disagree with somebody who's invested themselves entirely in politics, for example, if you disagree with them on like the most minor thing, they'll flip out and they'll become very aggressive. And they're the kind of people that you're like, whoa, I don't really be around this person. I feel like they're going to beat me up for my differing political views. And that happens. I know we like to sit around and pretend that only happens on the left, but there are a lot of people on the right who get just as worked up. I've kind of encountered it with the people that have placed their entire belief in the QAnon deal.
Yes. Yeah. And I've encountered that as well, but we don't need to go into that because I've talked enough about that situation on this channel endlessly. So
that's ultimately the problem, though, when people do that, because as the Catechism of the Church says, inscribed on the human heart, there is a desire to be with God. Every human being has this. That's why you'll see ideas that are not necessarily Christian, but they may have one thing in them that resonates with Christianity. They got one thing right, even if they get everything else wrong. And that's because that one thing can come from the fact that even if they've reached the wrong conclusion, they were still yearning for God when they thought that up or something. And when people place their identity in things other than Christ, it's sort of like the narcissist who has the real self, which is hidden away and they don't want to acknowledge it because it doesn't match up with their ideal self. And that real self is essentially the identity in Christ that on their deepest core of their being, they feel called to, but they've rejected that in favor of this fake image. And when that's challenged, they just freak out, just like a narcissist with narcissistic rage.
Indeed. You know, and the I guess the more important question though that I heard in an interview with Dennis Miller was talking to Nick DePaul, and obviously they're both comedians, but they were talking on Dennis's podcast from Thursday. Will shenanigans like this ever stop? And unfortunately, I hate to say this, but I think as the age of social media continues to grow, and as sound bites become more and more extreme and more vitriolic, I think we'll unfortunately see more of these cases in the future. So I don't know, but not good news at all. And unfortunately, I don't think the one thing that bothers me about all these hoaxes, whether it be Jussie Smollett or namely Christine Blasey Ford. Someone brought this up to me the other day too. We never seem to learn as a society just how dangerous these false accusations are society-wise, and that's concerning, because that's one of the ways in which our society has fall apart and will eventually crumble completely, I believe. So
I think people just need to. I think people just need to not. Well, ultimately people just need not to jump the gun on things like these, and they need to think about the consequences of when you put a story out like this, because there are real life consequences to it. And I know we've alluded to a lot of them here, but it is very dividing, and it just makes it harder for anybody in the future to bridge that gap. My caution to anybody listening, or to just Americans in general, would be aware of what your actions create and the message that they send, because that message can be very damaging, and it can have repercussions through the country.
Since our closing theme kind of seems to be giving some advice to help people avoid falling into this, I guess mine would be that people need to be critical thinkers again. I'll use an example from just this evening. Right before we went on the podcast, I was debating the Venezuela situation with a guy, and he disagrees with me on this, but he shared with me an article from the Independent talking about the low turnout in the last Venezuelan presidential election, and the turnout figure that was provided in this article, it was the Independent, turned out not to be accurate. But most people who are reading that might not have noticed, because they'll just take it. They don't critically think. They just read it in the newspaper and they assume that, well, the newspaper, it's reported a stat, so it's got to be right. But it stood out to me instantly that the 20% figure they were citing was the one provided by the opposition party. They didn't cite any other figure. They just cited the one from the opposition. And that was good enough for this gentleman, apparently. And I pointed that out to him, and he did rethink it, and he did start looking around and found out that there were other figures floating around out there as well. So I guess my advice to people is to just think critically, and realize that, especially with privately owned media, that there is an agenda being pushed. When you have press like we do in America, that it's entirely corporate owned, it essentially serves to push the agenda of the people that own the paper, not necessarily to accurately reflect news. So think about that.
Well, I mean, I think the same thing could be argued with state-run media, depending on who's in charge. But you know, that's a whole nother topic for another time. So I know it's getting late here for everyone. So any final thoughts and wrap up thoughts for this evening from either of you gentlemen?
Not on my end.
Don't write checks if you're going to commit a crime. That's my other. Don't commit crimes in the first place. But if you are, don't write checks.
Try and keep your identity a secret. It helps.
Well, I mean, here's a better one. Just don't start hoaxes and don't do this stuff in the beginning. I mean, this is one thing I do kind of want to bring up real quick. It's I have not watched the Oscars in quite a few years. I love movies. I love watching films. It's a favorite topic of mine to discuss on the show. Sometimes when we're not discussing politics, but I have to say that I'm getting real sick and tired of all these celebrities constantly, preaching their quote unquote moral virtues from their golden palaces in Hollywood, and while thumbing their nose at the rest of us. And Jussie Smollett kind of indirectly is what was doing that with this whole hoax, in my opinion. He was essentially saying, "Oh well, I'm going." He was essentially sparking racial animosity, and I guarantee you, like I said, I haven't watched the Oscars, but I guarantee you that if he had gotten his way and never been found out, we would be hearing speech after speech after speech in Hollywood about this. So, just I guess my whole thing is don't be a scumbag to begin with. It's just that simple. So, alrighty, folks. We don't have any interesting chat comments, just people, chiming in and saying hello. Thanks to everyone who tuned in. I know that we covered a diverse range of topics, and this format of the podcast is generally more casual, so we appreciate you for listening. And we'll be doing this every week on Sundays, as we usually do, at around 9 p.m. Eastern. So tune in here if you enjoy the podcast. So thank you very much for listening and hitting that like button and subscribing on iTunes. And from all us here at American Watchmen, good night, God bless, and God save this great nation.